Hey folks, I just wanted to say hello to everybody. Hope you're all doing well. This is going to be picking up after our basic introduction to the kingdom Plantae. So this lesson is going to pick up where we left off last time we got together and start examining a little bit more about the taxonomy of plants and the different categories into which they fall. I'm going to preface this by letting you all know that if you're in my class and waiting for assignments, I'm not going to talk about them in this video. I will post them to the Blackboard site afterwards. I'm also going to recommend that while you are watching this video, I'm going to have placed a copy of sort of a summary of the lecture notes in the Blackboard folders for you to access. It'll contain the spellings of a lot of the important vocabulary. So it's my strong recommendation that you have that available for you to take a look at while I am going through this so that you have those terms for your reference and so forth. But that being said, let's get started here. Okay, now we had left off having identified some basic fundamental features of the kingdom Plantae. Let's recall that we're talking about different features of a group of organisms. We could talk about primitive features versus derived features. The primitive features are the ones that predate the taxonomic group we're discussing, that they evolved in something earlier. They're not defining features of that group of organisms. The derived features are the recent evolutionary innovations, if you will. I say recent in the sense of new to the group we are talking about. It does not have to be recent in an absolute time sense. So derived features are the features that characterize a particular group of organisms. Primitive features are the ones that they inherited from preceding ancestors. When we are looking at plants, a lot of the things that people take for granted about plants, you might recall, things like being a multicellular, autotrophic, photosynthetic eukaryote. Those things are primitive features. They predated plants. They predated green algae even. Those were things that were found in protists before them. Likewise, having chloroplasts containing chlorophyll A and B. That is also a primitive feature that predated the coming of the kingdom Plantae. That's a feature that was not diagnostic. And having cellulose cell walls, also a feature that predated the kingdom Plantae and predated the green algae. So all those things that you might think of as kind of straightforward, this is what a plant is all about, they came well before plants. Let's move up in our taxonomic scale. Let's move to the collective group of organisms in our family tree of life that contains plants and green algae, the tracheophytes. And remember that they have some shared features that green algae and plant have that none of the preceding organisms have. So the derived features of the common group containing green algae plus plants, remember that would include rosette cellulose synthesizing complexes, that is those little rose-shaped protein clusters that make cellulose. Phragmoplasts, Phragmoplast, which are alignments of cytoskeletal fibers and Golgi-derived vesicles that you find along the midline of the cell as it's preparing for division, that possessing peroxisome enzymes for nutrient recapture is a feature both Charophyceans and plants have, and having flagellated sperm is a feature both Charophyceans and plants have. Those are all derived features for the common group of green algae plus plants, and on that basis, remember, some folks have argued that green algae belongs as a primitive plant. But then we have a group of features that plants and plants alone have, things that are found in the kingdom Plantae that are not found in a shared group with the green algae. So if I'm looking at plants as they are currently defined and plants alone, everything I've just talked about up till that point, all of that is primitive features for plants. So the peroxisomes, the phragmoplasts, the rosette complexes, all of those things are primitive for plants alone. They are derived for plants plus green algae, meaning that they defined that group. But now we got features that plants have that other things do not. Features that define plants as we know them now in a single group. You might recall we have the alternation of generations, that plants alternate between a haploid generation we call the gametophytes, which produces haploid gametes. Then those combine with other plants' gametes to form a diploid generation that we call the sporophytes. And then the sporophyte produces haploid spores, which all by themselves, without being fertilized, can become new gametophytes. So we alternate between gametophyte, gametophyte, sporophyte. Another feature that defines plants is the possession of multicellular gametangia, that is, gamete-producing organs. You might recall that the male gametangia are called antheridia. They're the smaller and more abundant ones. The female gametangia are the archegonia. Those are the larger and less abundant ones. You are going to recall that plants are characterized by having apical meristems, meaning they have little plates of growth at the tips of roots and shoots that allow for continued growth and expansion of the plants. You might recall that our plants exhibits walled spores, that they have a spore surrounded by a protective coating of a protein called sporopollenin to guard the spore until it's able to germinate. And finally, we have multicellular dependent embryos. That is, an embryo that is nourished by the tissue of the female parent before the plant is able to continue in its own right. Those are all features that plants and plants alone have separate from green algae. They are derived features for kingdom Plantae. Obviously, multicellular dependent embryos are a thing that has happened in other eukaryotic organisms. It's evolved independently in plants, as far as we can tell. A couple of other things that not all plants have, but most plants have. Most plants have a cuticle. A cuticle is a waxy coating on the outside of the plants that provides waterproofing. This is really important because for our land plant, think about that for a moment. All living plants are what we call land plants. Now, when plants made the jump evolutionarily to being on land from the water, that gave them a huge advantage. Unfiltered sunlight, that meant easier time growing. Rich atmospheric carbon dioxide, way more raw material for photosynthesis. So being on land is going to let your plants grow much more than they did in the water. Downside of being on land, of course, is you have to worry about drying out, and you have to worry about supporting your own weight against gravity. The cuticle helps with the former problem. The cuticle helps with the issue of drying out, because the cuticle is a waxy coating on the outside of the plant that prevents desiccation. So that's a really important adaptation of plants to be able to function in a land environment. Waterproofs the plant, keeps it from drying out. Another feature that we will find that most plants are going to have, not all, but most, are going to be what we call secondary compounds. Secondary compounds have two basic roles. One, they are going to help to absorb UV radiation. Again, when your plant is out on land, one of the things it has to concern itself with, that it didn't have to concern itself with as much in the water, is more direct exposure to UV rays. You're not getting them filtered through the water as much. So having your secondary compounds helps provide protection against UV radiation. Also, you will find that a lot of these secondary compounds aid the plant in defense, helping to protect it against predatory animals that would feed on it. A lot of these are compounds like terpenes. You might recall terpenes from Bio 1. They're a type of lipid. Alkaloid compounds, a lot of poisons are alkaloids in nature. There are some examples of secondary compounds that you're going to find in most but not all plants. All right, so that's kind of our basis here. This is how we understand what a plant is. Remember that I did say the other day, and I want to remind you all of this now, there is a lot of argument about this, that we are not 100% sure if our current definition of the kingdom Plantae is a good one. And there's some argument that says that we should redefine plants to include the green algae as a kind of basal plant. But right now, this is where we stand. So, in the kingdom Plantae as it is presently defined, let's talk a little bit of taxonomy for a minute. There have been a few phyla of plants that have gone extinct since kingdom Plantae first appeared, somewhere on the order of about 475 to 500 million years ago. Now, some of these taxonomic groups that I'm about to tell you about, I should point out, are also a little bit fuzzy right now. Plant taxonomy has not been as well sorted as animal taxonomy, which is ironic because the first taxonomists, like Linnaeus, were actually botanists, that plants were classified well before animals were. But we do find that in modern biology, plants have not gotten nearly as much attention as the kingdom Animalia. There are way more zoologists than there are botanists. And as a result, you're going to find that there's a lot of argument about plant classification. It's further clouded by the fact that a lot of plants have traditional names that are not the same as their scientific names, or the same plant might be called different things in different locations of the world, or that a lot of plants that are actually closely related don't resemble one another very closely. As a result, plant taxonomy has been tricky to sort out. Most botanists are of the belief that there are about somewhere around 300,000 identified living species of plants. The real total might be 10 times that. It's hard to go into a rainforest or a deep forest anywhere in the world and not find an unfamiliar plant species or two. So we don't know how much plant diversity is out there. We don't know how much plant diversity things like clear cutting and logging have cost us before we even knew it was there, and are still costing us. But the present state of plant taxonomy, we have 10 recognized phyla of living plants. All plants currently alive fall under a single broad heading called the embryophytes, Embryophytes, the embryophytes. That is, plants with embryos. They are otherwise called land plants. 10 living phyla fall under the heading of the embryophytes. Now let's break this down further. There are two major groupings, subgroupings within the embryophytes. One group, the bryophytes, consists of 3 other phyla. The other group, the tracheophytes, consists of 7 of those 10 phyla. Now, another thing I want to point out here, a term I may or may not have used in this class before, is the difference between a monophyletic group of organisms and a polyphyletic group. Monophyletic, M-O-N-O-P-H-Y-L-E-T-I-C, monophyletic. Take that word apart, mono for one, phyletic from phylum or from phylogeny, that is a group of related things. A monophyletic group of organisms is a group of organisms in which all of them share one common ancestor. That is, every organism in the group can be traced to a single common ancestor. When we are endeavoring to classify living things as much as possible, we want our taxonomic classifications to be monophyletic. We don't want to be grouping things together that do not share a common ancestor and talking about their shared traits. If a group of organisms is monophyletic, their shared traits generally can be assumed to come from common descent, that is, homology. Whereas if a group is polyphyletic, some of those shared features might be a result of convergent evolution rather than having been inherited from a singular common ancestor, because there isn't a recent singular ancestor. So when I'm talking about these groups of plants that I'm going to give you right now, some of these groupings are going to be monophyletic, others are going to be polyphyletic. If a group of organisms is polyphyletic, remember poly means many, a polyphyletic group is a group of organisms that has more than one ancestor. That is, they're a group of organisms that do not all share one single common ancestor. Sometimes polyphyletic groups are meaningful for discussion. I can say, all right, here's a group of things that may not all share one recent common ancestor, but they have features in common that makes us meaningful for us to classify them as one group for discussion purposes, as long as we remember that just being in a polyphyletic group together does not automatically imply a close shared relationship. Like, let's suppose I'm talking about an oceanic ecosystem. It makes sense to talk about oceanic predators, for their roles in the ecosystem, and that might include sharks, and that might include sperm whales, and that might include jellies. All those are predatory animals, but they don't have one recent common shared ancestor. But we can talk about them together as something that tells us things about the ecological roles they fulfill. So anyhow, getting back to where I was at, my plant groupings, my classifications I just gave you. And if you want to break this down, kind of draw yourself a little chart as we go here, that your Bryophytes, 3 of those phyla, are a polyphyletic group. That is, the 3 out of the 10 living plant phyla that are the bryophytes are polyphyletic. That is, they're not all sharing one common bryophyte ancestor. They share one common embryophyte ancestor. They share one common ancestor with the ancestor of all plants, but there's not one singular bryophyte from which all of them are descended. We group them together because they all have the shared feature of being a non-vascular type of plants. That is, that they don't have an internal network of tubes or vessels for moving around fluids and nutrients. The other 7 of the 10 living phyla of plants are the tracheophytes. I should give you some spellings here in case you're not following with the handout. Bryophyte, B-R-Y-O-P-H-Y-T-E, and tracheophyte, like trachea, T-R-A-C-H-E-O-P-H-Y-T-E, tracheophytes. About the tracheophytes, 7 of the 10 living plant phyla are tracheophytes. They encompass about 93% of all living plants. The tracheophytes are vascular plants, meaning that they have an internal network of tubes or ducts for moving around nutrients and fluids. Tracheophytes, as far as we can tell, are a monophyletic group. They all share one common tracheophyte ancestor. Now, under the heading of tracheophytes, we got 7 phyla within the tracheophytes. Let's break that down further. 2 of the 5 tracheophyte phyla are what we call seedless vascular plants, meaning that they are tracheophytes, they're vascular, they have vessels within them, but they do not produce a seed as a reproductive structure. There are 2 phyla of seedless vascular plants within the tracheophytes. They are not a monophyletic group. They do not have one recent common seedless vascular ancestor. The other 5 living phyla of tracheophytes are going to be called spermatophytes, S-P-E-R-M-A-T-O-P-H-Y-T-E, spermatophytes. The spermatophytes are better known as the seed plants. They're characterized by the production of seeds as their defining structures. Seed plants are going to make up the majority of living plant species. About 90% of all living plants are seed plants. It's far and away the most successful group of plant life. And as far as we can tell, seed plants are a monophyletic group. All seed plants have a common seed plant ancestor. Let's break it down further. Within the seed plants, we have 2 major groups, 5 phyla, 2 big groups. First off, we have the gymnosperms, G-Y-M-N-O-S-P-E-R-M-S, gymnosperms. So did I spell that right? G-Y-M-N-O. Yeah, right, okay. Sorry, I got lost saying it out loud, Gymnosperms are what we call the cone-bearing plants. They are characterized by not producing flowers or fruits. 4 of the 5 spermatophyte phyla are gymnosperms. They're the older variety. We think that they are a monophyletic group. There's some dispute about this, but we think that all gymnosperms might have a common gymnosperm ancestor. Then we have the angiosperms. The angiosperms are going to consist of exactly one plant phylum, the phylum Anthophyta. The angiosperms are the flowering plants. They're plants characterized by having flowers and fruits. Angiosperms make up the majority of living plants. Nearly 90% of all plants are angiosperm plants. They are far and away the most successful group of plants. There is a lot of dispute, I should point out, about this particular classification. There is considerable argument within botany that the angiosperms probably constitute more than one distinct phylum of plant life. There has not been enough good genetic sequence at this time to sort it out cleanly, but it's considered likely by botanists that we're going to end up splitting up the phylum Anthophyta into more than one flowering plant phylum at some point. And finally, if we want to break that down even further, looking within the angiosperms, we have 2 more important subgroups. the monocots or monocotyledonous plants. You might recall those from the lab exercise that we did, that happened while I wasn't there. Or the dicots or dicotyledonous plants. And that has to do with their growth pattern, that monocots have one embryonic leaf, dicots have two. We'll talk more about them a little further down the line. So that is our kind of breakdown of the current taxonomy of the kingdom Plantae. Let me just give you a little chart here to show you that in more detail. Let's back that up a little bit. There we go. We get all that in. All right, so you can see we have the embryophytes, 10 phyla of embryophytes, are land plants, as we call them. Within the embryophytes, we have 3 phyla of bryophytes, or non-vascular plants, which I have listed here. The phylum Bryophyta, the phylum Anthocerotophyta, and the phylum Marcantiophyta. Under the heading of the tracheophytes, there are 7 living phyla of vascular plants. 2 of those are seedless vascular plants, the phylum Lycophyta and the phylum Pterophyta. 5 of them are spermatophytes, or seed plants. 4 of the spermatophyte phyla are gymnosperms, which you can see here. That includes the phyla Cycadophyta, the phylum Ginkgophyta, look at the spelling there, Ginkgo, the phylum Netophyta, look at the spelling there, Gneto, and the phylum Pinophyta. And then last but not least, we have 1 spermatophyte phylum that we call an angiosperm, and that would be the phylum Anthophyta, the flowering plants. So that is our overarching plant taxonomy. I think the best way to talk about the kingdom Plantae going forward here is to look at them broken down into those groups, to look at them in terms of those distinct classifications. And I think I'm going to recommend to all of you here, just to get a little something extra. I don't have a PowerPoint or anything put together for this, but I'm going to recommend that as you're going through this lecture and you want to get some good visuals, open up another window, have a Google image search window open, and look up some images of these. Find some pictures of Marcantiophytes and bryophytes and anthophytes and so forth to sort of guide you through this, so you can see visually a little bit of the diversity of the kingdom Plantae. It's a pretty awesome kingdom of life that has a lot of really cool variation. So, breaking down further, let's start with the very simplest living plants. Let's talk about the bryophytes. Bryophytes are going to be your non-vascular plants. They're not one single monophyletic group. They do not have one single common plant ancestor beyond the common ancestor of all plants. No one common bryophyte ancestor, I should say. The bryophytes have a couple of shared features in common that make it useful for us to talk about them. They are the oldest living plants. The earliest plants were likely bryophytes, and these represent the simplest and most primitive living plant varieties. Things shared in common by the bryophytes. First off, and by the way, B-R-Y-O phytes, P-H-Y-T-E. The bryophytes are all herbaceous. H-E-R-B-A-C-E-O-U-S, herbaceous. If a plant is herbaceous, that means it's a non-woody plant. It does not produce wood. All bryophytes are herbaceous plants. Bryophytes are characterized by having a gametophyte generation that is larger and more prominent than the sporophyte generation. So when you see a bryophyte plant, most of the time what you're looking at is its gametophyte variety. The sporophyte is usually much smaller and a much shorter part of the life cycle. In other words, the bryophyte life cycle is dominated by the haploid or gametophyte generation. Bryophytes do not have a lot of the features we expect a lot of plants to have. They do not have flowers. They do not produce fruit. Bryophytes do not have stems. They do not have leaves. they do not have roots. The green mass of the bryophyte is called the thallus. T-L-A-L-L-U-S, the thallus. And the thallus is what you're going to see when you look at a bryophyte. It's not distinct stem versus leaf. It doesn't have anything like that. The entire structure is a photosynthetic surface. Now, because bryophytes do not have internal vascular tissues, they have no internal mechanism of moving fluids or nutrients around. That means that every part of the thallus has to stay close to the ground in order to effectively draw water from the earth. Therefore, you'll find that bryophytes tend to form ground-hugging carpets. They form flat, low patches of plant material in which every part is very, very close to the earth. The tallest bryophytes, the very tallest bryophytes, which have specialized, as we call them, conducting tissues that allow them to move a little bit of fluid via capillary action, the very tallest bryophytes get up to maybe 2 meters tall, so a little bit over 6 feet. That is the exception, not the rule. The majority of bryophytes are very low-lying, very flat, ground-oriented sort of plants. They tend to thrive in well, okay, let's cut that. I'm not going to say they tend to thrive in moist areas because that's not always true. It depends on the bryophyte. Now, they don't have roots. Bryophytes are instead anchored to the soil by little tiny fibers called rhizoids. R-H-I-Z-O-I-D. Rhizoids, the silent H in there. Rhizoids anchor the plant to the soil, but they do not allow it to draw up water or nutrients. The thallus has to do that for itself, and therefore has to stay close to the soil. You will find that bryophytes tend to have very lightweight spores that are carried easily by wind. That's the sporophyte generation produces an extremely light spore that is easily caught by the wind and blown to new locations. So these are some things bryophytes can be expected to have in common. What makes them different from each other? Let's talk about the 3 distinct phyla of bryophytes. The most common bryophyte phylum, and the one that gives the group its name, is the phylum Bryophyta. The phylum Bryophyta consists of what we think of as mosses. Moss is quite a familiar variety of plant to all of you. They make up the vast majority of bryophytes. About 90% of all bryophyte species are mosses. Mosses, as you all know, are very low-lying plants, very flat, don't go far from the ground. They form carpets or beds on top of surfaces. They're often very, very soft. And mosses can thrive in a tremendous range of environments, folks. They're probably some of the most durable plants in the world. You can find mosses growing in environments where literally no other plant grows. You've got mosses that live in deserts. You've got mosses that live above the tree lines at the top of mountains. You even have mosses that live in polar environments. In fact, the only plants that are native to Antarctica are varieties of mosses found on islands at the northernmost edge of that continent. Now, mosses play a really important role in our planet's ecosystem because mosses soak up a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. They're a vital part of the carbon cycle on Earth. In particular, I want to talk about one specific variety of moss that is extremely important for the regulation of carbon dioxide on our planet, and that's a group of mosses called sphagnum. That's S-P-H-A-G-N-U-M, sphagnum. You italicize or underline that when you're writing it because sphagnum is a genus name. There are a bunch of species of sphagnum moss. They are better known, however, by the more common name peat moss, P-E-A-T, peat moss. You might have heard of a thing called a peat bog. Peat bogs are going to be wetland environments that they tend to be highly alkaline wetlands. Sphagnum thrives in peat bog environments. But of course, the plants in the fullness of time die, and they sink down into the bog. Now, here's the thing about peat bogs. Their highly alkaline environments mean that they don't decay things very well. Peat bogs are really good at preserving stuff. You might have heard of bog mummies, right? If you go to the mummies exhibit that's running over at the Carnegie Science Center, or well, okay, if you go to see it after we're allowed to go into public places again, then you might see some bog mummies there. And if not, I recommend you Google bog mummy. Sometimes people will die in a peat bog, or their bodies will have been deposited in a peat bog back in ancient times, and they sink down into the peat, but they don't fully decay because the alkaloid environment of the peat bogs retards bacterial growth. Therefore, the body gets preserved. It's almost like tanned leather. And you can pull a bog mummy out of a peat bog, and it looks pretty much the way the person looked when they died, except that they're stained a very dark color from all the tannins present in the water. Now, sphagnum moss also sinks down into the peat bogs whenever it dies, and it forms layers of partially decomposed plant matter on the bottom of the bog. Over time, those layers build up and build up and build up, and you form this dense mass of partially digested plant matter in the floor of the bog, sometimes going down several meters, that we call peat. Now, peat has an interesting history for human beings because peat has long been used by our society for a couple of different things. In ancient times, it was commonly employed as a soil conditioner. You put it in soil to add nutrients and to increase the alkalinity of the soil. I mean, our ancestors didn't know that's what they were doing, but it's what they were doing. So peat was often extracted from bogs and broken up and plowed into the soil to help condition the soil and increase its nutritional value. In addition, in places where trees were not abundant, peat has often been used as a source of fuel. What people would do is they would go into the peat bog, they would cut out blocks of peat from the floor of the bog, harvest them, dry them out, and then burn the peat. The peat is going to burn quite nicely. It's a slow-burning fuel. So in a place where you have wetlands, but you don't have a lot of trees, peat is often a much easier source for your fires than wood. In fact, in some parts of rural Ireland and Scotland, people still use peat fires to heat their little cottages out in the countryside. Now, humans have had a peat cutting industry for a long time. As long as there have been peat bogs, people have been exploiting them. But peat bogs are super important for the regulation of our planet's carbon cycle. Because, as I said, mosses are really, really good at soaking up carbon dioxide. They absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. You might have heard there's a trend recently towards moss lawns, people looking for alternatives to grass. If you have a moss lawn, on average, it will absorb something like 30 times as much carbon dioxide as a grass lawn would. So mosses soak up huge amounts of CO2. And when that peat dies and sinks into the bog and does not decay, it sequesters that carbon dioxide. It becomes a carbon dioxide sink. So peat bogs play a vital ecological role as carbon sinks in our planet's ecosystem, recycling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Well, here's the thing. We as humans have been exploiting peat bogs for a long time, and that means going into them, oftentimes draining them to cut out the peats. Even in the modern world, where we don't really rely on peat for burning very much in most parts of the world anymore, well, you want to build something, a peat bog is standing in your way. Let's be honest, most people are going to say, well, let's drain that stinking mosquito-filled wetland and put something useful on top of it, you know? So we pave over our peat bogs and we put Walmarts on top of them. And you know what? With every peat bog we destroy, we are helping to reduce our planet's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. In a time of increased greenhouse gases, the destruction of peat bogs is a really significant factor in harming our planet's ability to recover. We've realized this. There have now been a lot of laws put in place in many places saying that you can't drain peat bogs for construction, or that if you engage in construction that requires the draining of a peat bog, that you actually have to create a new wetland, that you have to set aside some land somewhere and flood it or otherwise make a wetland in that area in order to offset the loss of the bogs that you are going to be draining for your construction. Nonetheless, we need to be doing more of this. We need to be protecting peat bogs a lot more, and we need to be helping to restore boglands. Nobody likes bogs and swamps, but they are really, really important to our planet's ecosystem. By the way, you want something to be happy about with a corporation actually doing something good for the world. The Walt Disney Corporation has actually been really, really good about this. And every time Disney builds something new, expands a theme park, builds a new hotel, whatever, they actually buy areas of swampland in Florida. They buy wetlands and they designate them as nature preserves, protecting them so that those wetlands are going to be set aside and preserved. Anytime Disney clears land, they buy an equal amount or greater amount of wetland and make it part of a nature preserve. In fact, Disney owns the largest single nature preserve in Florida. The largest Disney property is not Walt Disney World, it is the Disney Wildlife Preserve, which is a preserved wetland that they are continually expanding as they can. So, that's sphagnum. You can see moss is pretty important. Moss is doing some good stuff. Now, there are two other phyla within the bryophytes. We also have the phylum Anthocerotophyta, Anthocerotophyta, Anthocerotophyta. Phylum Anthocerotophyta does not have a lot of taxonomic diversity, somewhere between 100 and 300 living species. Thrives in damp and humid environment. You need wet soil to grow Anthocerotophytes. It is believed that they are the oldest living plants, that they represent the closest thing we have to the beginnings of the kingdom Plantae. They have a feature that you don't see in any other plants, namely that they feature an organelle called a pyrenoid, P-Y-R-E-N-O-I-D, pyrenoid. Pyrenoid consists with a fusion of chloroplasts with other organelles, kind of clustering important organelles together around the chloroplast. You don't see that feature in any other plants. The Anthocerotophytes, you probably aren't terribly familiar with them. If you want to know an Anthocerotophyte, there's a plant called a hornwort, H-O-R-N-W-O-R-T-S, hornworts. We're talking about Anthocerotophytes. Most of them are the hornworts. They're little wetland plants. Look one up to get a picture of what hornworts look like. You'll see that suffix wort, W-O-R-T, in a lot of plant names. Wort is an old English word that means plant or herb. And finally, in the bryophytes, we have our third and final phylum, the phylum Marchentiophyta, M-A-R-C-H-A-N-T-I-O Phyta, Marchentiophyta. Phylum Marchentiophyta is a little bit more diverse. There are about 9,000 species of Marchentiophytes alive. They are shade-dwelling plants. They don't necessarily need wet environments, but they do best in damp, shady soil. They thrive well in darker environments, forest floors, that kind of thing. A lot of them are bog dwellers as well. They are a group of plants we call the liverworts, and they get that name because of an ancient folk belief that they could be used to treat diseases of the liver. And so look up a picture of some liverworts and you'll see what they look like. You'll get an idea about the kind of ground-hugging carpet arrangement that we see. They're going to look like they have leaves when you look at your liverwort, but what you're really seeing is the fleshy thallus, the body of the plant. There's no distinct stem. There's no distinct leaf. All right? So that would be our bryophytes. Now, they're the simplest plants. They make up about 7% of all living plant diversity. But let's move on to a more familiar variety of plant that you see around all the time. Let's talk about the tracheophytes, T-R-A-C-H-E-O phyte. The tracheophytes are vascular plants. Tracheophytes are a little bit more recent an evolutionary innovation than your bryophytes. Bryophytes go all the way back to the roots of the kingdom Plantae. There's your root pun for the day. Okay, tough crowd. All right, so, bryophytes go back 475 million to 500 million years. Your tracheophytes have only been around for about 420 million years. Now, when we're talking about tracheophytes, features that characterize your vascular plants. First and foremost, vascular plants are going to have a system of vessels or ducts. They're going to have internal ductwork, tubes and passageways for moving fluids around. This is a strongly characteristic feature of them. They have two kinds of vascular tissue, as we put it, that move stuff around. And they have really wonderful names. These two kinds of vascular tissue are called xylem and phloem. Love those names. Xylem, spelled X-Y-L-E-M. There's a good Scrabble word right there. You'll get lots of points for that one. Xylem is a vascular tissue that conducts water and minerals. Now, in some vascular plants, xylem is reinforced with a specialized protein called lignin, L-I-G-N-I-N. Lignin makes the xylem stiff and rigid. You know lignin by another name, wood. So a woody plant is one in which the xylem is reinforced and cemented together by the lignin protein. So wood is a feature that you will see in some, but not all, vascular plants. Many are herbaceous, some are woody. The other vascular tissue is called phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M. It's a fun word right there. Phloem is a vascular tissue that is specialized for distributing sugars, amino acids, and other organic molecules. So all of my vascular plants have xylem and phloem. Having those features means that vascular plants can get much, much taller. Not all of them necessarily are, but having vascular tissue means that not every part of the plant has to be in close contact with the ground. They can conduct nutrients from the soil up through other parts of the plant, and that means the plant can grow much taller. In particular, woody plants, because they are reinforced by lignin, can stand up and bear their own weight against gravity much more effectively, and therefore woody plants become the tallest plants. Indeed, woody plants are among the largest living things on our planets. Now, in addition to the vascular tissues, vascular plants have another couple of really important features, including some that we might think of as characteristic of the kingdom Plantae as a whole. Vascular plants have stems. A stem is a supportive structure that branches and produces leaves and sporangia. The stem produces leaves and sporangia, that is, spore-producing organs. In some varieties of vascular plants, stems also give rise to flowers, but not in all. So the stem is a branching structure. The vascular tissues, the tubes, go through them, and they give rise to our leaves, our sporangia, our spore-producing organs, and in some species, our flowers. Now, can't talk about stems without talking about leaves. Arguably, one of the most defining features of being a plant in most people's heads would be the leaf. Leaves are broad surfaces designed for maximum sun absorption. The entire purpose of a leaf is to maximize the surface area available for sun exposure, and thereby to produce more glucose via photosynthesis. Leaves come in a couple of different varieties. There's a type of leaf called a microphyll, micro, P-H-Y-L-L. Microphyll leaves are small spine-shaped leaves, little spiky leaves with a single vein going through them. They were the first leaves to appear about 410 million years ago. Later, we're going to evolve a more leafy-looking variety of leaf, if you will, called a megaphyll, M-E-G-A, P-H-Y-L-L. Megaphylls are broad leaves. They're what you probably think of when you think of a leaf. Megaphylls have a larger surface area and a highly branched vascular system. Not one single vein, but lots of veins branching throughout their structure. Megaphyll leaves have been around for about 370 million years. It's believed that they evolved from a web of tissue that developed between either different stems of the same plants or between microphyll leaves within the same plants. As a result, joining nearby stems or branches together. Cool thing about leaf growth is that you will find that in a lot of plants, leaves have a growth pattern in which they endeavor to grow as much as possible, sort of switchbacking around each other, so that they do not actually absorb each other's light. Basically, trying to grow in such a pattern is that each leaf is obstructing as few other leaves as possible in order to maximize the amount of sunlight the plant is able to absorb. That discovery was actually made by a very unlikely person. Some of you might be aware that there was a computer scientist by the name of Alan Turing. Alan Turing was the father of modern computer science. If you know your World War II, then you might be aware that he was the guy who broke the Enigma code, the Nazi submarine code. He was one of the great unsung heroes of World War II. By breaking Nazi codes, the Allies learned about Nazi plans and movements far in advance. It was instrumental to their defeats. Later, however, Alan Turing lost his security clearances. Even after the war was over, he was unable to do secret coding work for the British government after his invention of the computer, in large part because they found out that he was gay. His security clearances were pulled. He was imprisoned for a time under English laws that existed at the time against homosexuality. Following that, he wasn't really able to work in computer science anymore because it was pretty much all being done by governments at that point. And so he turned his mathematical genius to another field. In the last couple years of his life, before his very tragic suicide in 1954, Alan Turing devoted his attention not to computers, but to plant morphogenesis, to studying the patterns of growth in plants and the mathematical distribution of growth in plants, although his research on that subject was not actually published until the 1990s. So a little bit of history there for you today. Now, other features that your vascular plants have, we have leaves, we have stems, and the last very important feature that we see appearing in vascular plants that was not in bryophytes is roots. Remember, bryophytes had rhizoids, which anchored them to the soil. Your vascular plants are going to have roots. Roots are going to serve the same function as a rhizoid, serving to anchor the plant to the ground. But in addition, the root has an absorption function. The root is capable of soaking up water and nutrients from the soil and transmitting them up to the vascular tissues. That is the big reason why vascular plants can grow so far from the ground, because they have a root system that allows them to pull up water and nutrients much more effectively, and then a vascular system that lets them distribute those things to every part of the plant that requires them. It is believed that roots evolved more than once in the course of plant evolution. Not every plant with a root has a common root-bearing ancestor. And it's thought that roots evolved from basically the bottom of the stem. That the stem grew in both directions, upward and downward. The downward part of the stem evolved into the modern roots, and the upward part of the stem into the plant body as we know it today. So those are our characteristic features of the vascular plants. Now you might recall within vascular plants, we have two broad subheadings. We have your seedless vascular plants, 2 phyla of those, and we have your spermatophytes or seed plants, 5 phyla of those. But I'm looking at the time and I have been talking to you all for just about 50 minutes, so I think that's a good time to tie this off. Next lesson that I give you, we are going to discuss the vascular plants in more detail. We're going to go through their different varieties, find out more about what they do, what roles they play in the ecosystem, and how they differ from one another. Thank you for your attention, everybody. Talk to you soon. Have a good day.